So if you have a manual transmission, you may well experience a grinding or a crunching of the gears. The first and second gears are usually notoriously the first gears to start being affected by this phenomena. But in this video, we're just going to help you to understand what's going on inside the gearbox, how the clutch mechanism is working and engaging, and just help you to diagnose these clutch problems. Now, if you've got a gearbox that is always crunching in gear, that crunching noise is basically metal crashing into other pieces of metal, and it is going to degrade, and the more that happens, the worse the problem is going to get. So it really is something you need to jump on quite quickly. If you can fix the problem early on, you may well end up saving yourself a very expensive replacement gearbox. So one of the first things you should really check is just the noise that happens when you press the clutch down and when you lift the clutch up. So you've got your clutch release bearings and the pilot bearings, and over time these start to wear. If you're one of those drivers that always has their foot on the clutch, you're putting a lot of extra stress and strain in the clutch system, and it's generally these poor little bearings that take the hit when you keep your foot on the clutch. So don't do that, it's going to cause you problems in the long run. If you press the clutch down and you've got a significant change in the note coming from the transmission, that can indicate it's the release bearing that is starting to wear. And if the transmission noise starts as you release the clutch, that is probably the pilot bearing. So there's just a few little things to check early on, and the bearings are probably the obvious first thing to do. It's quite an easy test that you can do. But the clutch itself, that's involved in disengaging the gears from the engine and re-engaging them afterwards. So when you change gear, the engine speed also needs to change. So if you change up a gear or down a gear, the RPMs on the engine need to be adjusted. Now, that doesn't happen instantly. So gearboxes are equipped with a mechanism known as the Synchro Ring that helps the gears spin at the correct speed as they engage and prevents them crashing into each other. So if that synchro ring has started to become worn and degraded, you're not going to have that protection, and you're going to have the gear teeth actually crashing into each other when you try to engage gears. So I would say the most common cause of gearbox crunching is actually down to the clutch itself. If the clutch isn't fully disengaging and engaging properly, you are going to have that crunching noise as you change gears. You want the gearbox to be completely isolated from the engine when you make that change in the gear. So manufacturers have moved away from the older clutch cable systems, and you've got fairly complex hydraulic clutch systems now. Even automatic gearboxes have clutch systems within them, and again, these can degrade, but we're going to focus primarily on the manual transmission in this video. We're not going to look at those very clever automatic gearboxes with the clutch arrangement. So the clutch is operated by cable. That cable will over time stretch. Some cars have automatically adjusting cables, others don't. They may need to be manually adjusted, but as that cable starts to stretch, it will start to affect the way the clutch engages or disengages. So that's a relatively cheap fix. Just replacing the cable or the adjustment mechanism within that clutch system can often bring things back into line. Now, as you use the clutch, you may notice the biting point is very high. So almost as soon as you touch the clutch pedal, you're starting to disengage the engine. So that can be a classic sign of a worn clutch. So if you notice it slipping, so that is where you accelerate and the engine takes a little while to get that extra RPMs down onto the wheels. So effectively there's lag. You might notice the RPMs rising up and then sinking down as it matches. So if that clutch itself is not biting as well as possible, it's going to start to slip and you're not going to be able to put the power down, and that could well be causing the problem with you changing gears and having that horrible crunchy noise when you do so. In some instances of a problem caused with really thick car mats, now they prevent the clutch pedal from going all the way down. It's effectively an extra cushion that just prevents that last little bit of clutch pedal travel. If you get mats that are tailor-made for your car, it's unlikely you have this problem, but often these aftermarket one-size-fits-all mats are just an inappropriate shape and thickness and will often interfere with the clutch pedal travel. So if you've just recently fitted new mats in your car and you're having this crunching problem, take those mats out and just see if it was a problem. So you can get the clutch pedal and the clutch cable and all of the physical linkages and mechanisms within the gearbox physically checked just to make sure that it's not an adjustment issue. If it is, again, that's a relatively cheap fix. So other common causes of crunching of your gearbox is really your driving style. If you do racing gear shifts all the time and you're not properly using the clutch and you're actually crashing through the gears as you change gear, each time you do that, it's going to be taking a little bit of metal off the gears and off the synchro rings, and you're going to start to degrade the performance of your gearbox. You may notice the problem only happens in cold weather, when the engine is cold and the transmission is cold. So that might actually indicate there's an issue with the fluid you have in the gearbox itself. It may just need a change of transmission fluid. If the transmission fluid is low, you're not getting sufficient lubrication in the gearbox, and that will accelerate the wear and tear on the gearbox itself. Now, replacing the gearbox is probably the big expensive thing you don't want to happen. Replacing a clutch is relatively inexpensive, although a bit of a pain, and it still costs a fair bit of money. Making adjustments to the clutch cable and the gear change mechanisms actually on the gearbox is probably the cheapest thing you can do, and it's never worth doing a trial and error system. You really need to sit down and try and determine the actual cause for the crunching gearboxes. Now, often I see cases where the clutch has been worn and people have pretty much ignored it, and it started crunching, and it's got so bad that it's got to the point where they've had to take the car in and get the gearbox actually changed. And in a lot of those cases, the damage has already been done to the gearbox, so they get the new clutch fitted and they've still got a problem with the synchro ring on the gearbox or the actual gear mechanism inside the transmission. So if that's the case, you've got an expensive repair on top of the already costly clutch replacement that you've just had done. Always trying to avoid crunching the gears, so that's a symptom of a problem. It's not something you should ignore. Now, you can mitigate that problem from happening by trying to match the revs. So as you go up and down the gears, if you allow the engine speed to increase, blip the throttle, or give it a little bit of time to settle as you ease off the throttle when you change gear, that can go some way to minimizing the amount of work those worn synchro rings have to do. And if you can get into double clutching as well, I've got another video that's dealt with the issue of double clutching and what that actually entails. It's something drivers used to do before we even had synchro mesh fitted on cars, so it's actually a forgotten art. But using the double clutch method just gives the transmission time to match the engine speed and makes for much smoother engagement of the gears. If you do get the clutch replaced, make sure also the release bearings are also replaced. It's certainly not worth cutting corners using the existing cable, the existing release bearings and any other components within the clutch assembly, because they've already done quite a bit of work, they're quite worn, and they may well be the next thing to go. While the gearbox is off and they're working in that area of the car, it's relatively cheap just to commit to buying those extra parts. It will certainly give you peace of mind in the long run. So I hope this video has been useful to you. It's just helped you to diagnose the possible causes for crunching of your gears when you change gears, and it really is something you shouldn't ignore. Jump on it quickly. These problems will escalate and get worse over time if they're ignored. So please boot that like button if you found this useful. That really does help us to get out there. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. We'd love you to stay tuned, and I've lined this video up for you that you should find really interesting. Thanks for watching.